Hi everyone, my name is Amir Englund. I am a researcher at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's College London. For the past 8 years or so, I have studied the effects of cannabis in people, and I'm going to give you a short kind of my view of cannabis and some of the research that we do here. Now, at the moment, I am in one of King's Hospital's research facilities. It's called the Clinical Research Facility. I'll take you a little tour now. So here is one of the side rooms, is where we do some of our testing. That's where some of our healthy volunteers sit and lie down and relax after they've had a healthy dose of cannabis. I'll just close this door behind me, and behind me here is a lovely volcano vaporizer device that we use in our study. I still need to remove it after today's experiment. So I'll talk to you just for a few minutes. I'm sorry about the camera angle of this webcam. It's not great, so it might look a bit odd. I'm going to talk to you a bit about cannabis, some of the research around what we do, and my views on it. So just to take you through, cannabis is a plant. It makes lots of different chemical compounds, and some of those compounds are known as cannabinoids, cannabis-specific compounds. Now, the most common of the cannabinoids is THC. It's the one that gets people high when they use it, and they get a big dose of that. Sometimes people can get a bit anxious, a bit paranoid, have some strange ideas, and it can influence how well they do on memory tests. And the second most common compound in cannabis is CBD, cannabidiol. On its own, doesn't do anything to healthy volunteers. People we've given it to in the past could not tell the difference between that and a placebo, a sugar pill. But some of the more recent research has found that CBD can offset some of the negative effects of a high dose of THC. Cannabis, the plant itself, makes both of these two compounds from the same precursor material called CBG. And you can crossbreed cannabis like you can with most plants to get the end product that you want. And now cannabis has been heavily crossbred, so most cannabis varieties will produce only THC. So when you maximize THC levels to that extent, there's no space for CBD because they're made from the same compound. If you want more CBD, it's going to cost you THC. So there's like a balance in between there. So some plants are only CBD and have very little THC. A recent study that came out this year found that what we call high potency cannabis, that has high levels of THC and virtually no CBD, dominate the London market. So around 96% of all cannabis on the black market is the high potency variety. Hash used to come from, and still does, from Northern Africa. Used to have a 1-to-1 ratio of THC and CBD, and that's slightly shifted now. So it has a bit more THC than it has CBD. Still relatively weak product, but it's very rare. So only about 2% of the black market is hash. So it's quite difficult to find. One of the reasons we think about potency and worry about it is because it's been related to some greater risks from using cannabis. Now, in the UK, it's been the case that over the past couple of decades, cannabis use in the population has kind of gone down and stayed stable, while during the same period over the last 10 years, there's been a 50% increase in people seeking help for their cannabis use, mainly addiction. So feelings that they can't really cope with life as it is because of their cannabis use. They feel that cannabis use has gotten out of hand. They spend too much time using it or recovering from it. They spend a lot of money on it. They avoid doing chores. They don't fulfill their obligations, work, school, They don't meet family and friends as much. And they can also feel physiological signs of dependence. One is tolerance, which is you need more and more to feel the same effect from the drug. And the other one is withdrawal. So when you stop using cannabis, you feel not so great. And that's actually been the case in Europe as well. So treatment seeking for any drug problem, cannabis is the main cause of going to treatment nowadays. And a study recently published by a colleague of mine, Dr. Tom Freeman, he found that in Dutch coffee shops in early 2000, the average percentage of THC in coffee shops was 8%. That went up to over 20 in just around 4 years. And after that, the coffee shops, the customers there complained a bit that it was a bit too high, so the market adjusted and now it's around 15%. But he also looked at how many people sought help for cannabis problems. And with a 5-year time lag, he found that there was a similar increase and then a decrease in number of people who needed help. So there seems to be a relationship between the strength of cannabis and subsequent problems. Now, moving on to a slightly different topic is that of the very contentious topic, cannabis and psychosis. A lot of people would disagree that they have anything to do with each other, and there's a lot of still debate ongoing in the scientific community as well as the public domain and in media. The relationship is based on epidemiology, so studying big populations of people, following them up over time and seeing what happens to who, and seeing if things in their lives and things they've done and been exposed to make them more or less likely. Very consistently, many of the long-term, large-scale epidemiological studies have found that people who use cannabis are more likely to later in life have a psychotic illness. Now, psychosis on its own is quite rare, happens to about 1 person out of 100 in their lifetime. And the studies have found that people who've tried cannabis, out of that group, 2 out of 100 will end up with a psychotic illness. For the heaviest user is about 4. And a research paper just 3 years ago by a colleague of mine here at the Institute, Marta Di Forti, she found that users of UK hash, so one type of cannabis that's a bit milder and has more CBD in it, there was no increased risk among the people who used that, even when they smoked it every day. But for the higher potency variety, the one that's most prevalent on the black market today, it was a 5-fold increased risk if people used it every day. Now, we can't say that this is causal. It might be that people who have a predisposition of developing psychotic illness enjoy cannabis more for whatever reason, and they might also be more at risk from the harms of cannabis use. So the causality we can't know, because that type of study we just can't do. To get definite proof that cannabis causally related to psychosis or not, we need to do what's called a randomized controlled trial. So we randomly allocate people to using cannabis or not using cannabis. And that wouldn't be ethical, because we had to make sure that teenagers start using and they use for years and years, while we make sure other teenagers don't. In lack of that evidence, we need to acknowledge that there is an association. It might not be causal, but perhaps we should assume it is and take precautions, because if it's causal for some people, then it's a potentially avoidable risk factor. One way of looking at it is similar to what we do in heart disease. So things like poor diet, no exercise, stressful lifestyle, alcohol use, tobacco, genetic predisposition, all of these things contribute to the risk of having a heart attack, for instance, or a stroke. Now, in the same way, different risk factors interact with each other when it comes to psychosis. We don't have a cause. We can't scan a person's brain or get a blood test and say that person's psychotic. It's done in an interview and it's based on symptom ratings. So the scientific literature at the moment has a somewhat general consensus when it comes to cannabis and psychosis is that cannabis is a component cause. So it's just one component out of many other risk factors that together with other risks might cause a psychotic illness. But on its own, it's not sufficient and it's not necessary for development of psychotic illness. So that's where we stand. What we can say with more certainty is that for people who already have an established psychotic illness, cannabis leads to a worse outcome. And studies have followed up patients who use and don't use cannabis and find that people who have a psychotic illness and use cannabis and continue using, they have higher rates of relapse into their psychotic illness. They stay longer in inpatient care and their prognosis is worse. And especially if they smoke high potency cannabis, that effect is greater. So I think that for people who have a vulnerability, we need to be a bit extra cautious and maybe think about the advice that we give them and also maybe modify cannabis a bit to help with it. Because CBD, the second most common compound in cannabis, has been found to actually have antipsychotic effects. There's been a few clinical trials in patients with psychosis, one of which I helped run here at King's College. It was a multi-centered study. 88 patients were treated for 6 weeks with 1,000 milligrams of CBD a day or placebo, and they got that on top of their regular antipsychotic medication. Now, what that study found is that there was significant reduction in what we call positive psychotic symptoms. Those are, we call them positives because they're additive symptoms. So something's added onto a person, like hallucinations, seeing or hearing things that are not there, delusions, believing things that aren't real, and paranoia, suspiciousness, persecutory delusions and such. So we saw a reduction compared to placebo. And we also saw some trends that people's memory tended to be better on CBD compared to placebo, although that wasn't statistically significant. And also the clinicians who treated these patients found the patients on CBD to do better than the ones on placebo. So it's still early days. There's one study in patients who we call it treatment resistant, who've had it for years and years, and antipsychotic medication hasn't been helpful for them. So there was a study in 36 patients who had treatment resistant psychosis, and 600 milligrams a day of CBD did not benefit them. So CBD might be good for some psychoses, not for others. But then that brings us to our study and the volcano that's sitting behind me. Almost a year and a half ago, the Medical Research Council of the UK gave me and my research team some money to run this study. And it's a study to find out what the best ratio of THC and CBD in cannabis is. It's an experimental study. We invite healthy volunteers to come for 4 separate experiments. And on each of these experiments, they get the same amount of THC. And it's quite a high amount. It's 10 milligrams. Obviously, 10 milligrams depends on the potency of cannabis and how much of it you use. But a study a couple of years ago from Spain found that the average amount in a joint in Spain is 7 milligrams. So we give 10, which is slightly more than the average Spanish joint. So it's quite strong. But across these 4 sessions, 3 of them contain CBD. So the ratio for the first CBD visit is 1:1. So it's 10 milligrams THC, 10 milligrams CBD, 2:1 CBD, so 20 milligrams CBD, and 3:1. Volunteers come in on 4 visits and they get these 4 different types of cannabis in a randomized order. So you don't know which cannabis they get on which occasion. This volcano fills balloons, and we cover those balloons with nice orange bin bags so that they can't see the vapor if there's a vapor density. So they're completely blind and we're completely blinded to what they have on that day. After they've had the cannabis, we test their memory performance for about half an hour, different aspects of memory to see if higher levels of CBD results in better memory performance. We then have them rate the drug effect throughout the course of the day by filling out scales to indicate how high they're feeling, how sleepy they are, how relaxed, anxious, paranoid, if they want food, if they want more of the drug or less of it. Then we have a couple of pleasure elements because cannabis is pleasurable to most people who use it. We want to see if adding CBD diminishes or enhances the pleasurable effects of it. So we have a chocolate appreciation task and a music appreciation task. So they get to eat a piece of chocolate on every visit. It's the same kind of chocolate every time, and they rate whether or not the chocolate's nicer on that day, not as nice, or as nice as it usually is. Same thing, they choose a song that they listen to on every visit and rate whether or not that's nicer or not as nice or as nice as normal. After they've done those tasks, we go for a little walk in the corridors of the hospital to the Marks and Spencer shop, where we give them £2. They walk around the shop, they pick out items, pay for it at the till, and come back here. Once they've gotten back and sobered up a bit, we ask them a whole bunch of questions about their experience during the day. We give them questionnaires that measure if they've been paranoid or if they had any strange experience, and at the end we have a little interview where we kind of dig deeper to see whether or not there have been any psychotic-like symptoms. Sometimes people do report some strange experiences. Recently there was a participant that thought there was a big white bunny rabbit that jumped past the window next to us. Some get a bit suspicious of us, think that maybe that we filmed them on our phones during testing, and we actually had to show one of the participants that there was not a video of her on our phones. So there are some strange experiences, strange thoughts. They're not what you would get from a patient who's suffering from a psychotic illness, but some of the kind of core mechanisms, like the belief pattern and for a very short time the conviction. So some participants are very convinced of those things, but just a moment later talk their way out of it and realize that that wasn't actually the case. So we hope to be done sometime next year with this study. The aim is to get 45 healthy volunteers to do all 4 experiments, and then we'll analyze the data and hopefully publish it soon after that. And it's kind of an effort from us to find if there is a safer type of cannabis, if we can manipulate THC and CBD levels in cannabis and produce a drug that has less of an impact on memory, is less likely to make you paranoid, less likely to make you have strange thoughts and experiences, but still as pleasurable as cannabis is. Where we want that research to go is potentially as a means of harm reduction for people who develop problems with cannabis and they feel that they can't quit. Maybe there's a potential of like a cannabis replacement for those participants or patients. some last views, something that's very common nowadays. My little sign off will be on CBD oils that's available on the commercial market. Now, they're usually made of hemp, usually quite weak products. Some of these bottles contain up to 1,000 milligrams of CBD in them, in the whole bottle, and those can cost around £70. Now, the levels of CBD that in actual scientific studies have been found to be effective range between 600 and 1,500 milligrams a day. So that's quite a lot. And these little bottles of oil is very low potency. We don't really know if there's been any quality assurance. So I'm always very cautious when I hear people asking me about CBD oils, if there are patients asking about CBD oils. We believe that they contain far too little CBD to actually have a biological effect. So people who report potentially genuine positive benefits from using these oils, there is still a likelihood that that is just a placebo effect. This is something that we struggle with in research all the time, because sometimes the placebo effect is really, really powerful and outperform drugs that have been previously shown to be effective. I'm going to leave it there. On the policy side, I don't have that strong views. I think that criminalizing cannabis use is generally not a great strategy. There's not a lot of evidence to show that it's very effective to criminalize it. There's a lot of money behind cannabis, so that will probably still make it readily available. However, in a completely unregulated, legalized market, big companies can spend a lot of money advertising their products and advertising stronger products, which might be harmful. So I think it needs to have a pragmatic approach. I think cannabis in Canada might have such a pragmatic approach, so we'll just have to wait and see. But that's all for me. I hope you've enjoyed this video and gotten some information that you find useful from it. That's me from King's College London. Bye bye.